Call your parents, I said quietly, even though my cheek was still warm and the room felt too silent, like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next, and for the first time that night, my husband stopped talking. Ethan had been pacing across the living room just seconds before, his voice sharp, controlled, almost rehearsed, like he had gone over this moment in his head 100 times before finally deciding to say it out loud, and when he looked at me again, there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, not anger, not even disappointment, but certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from believing you've already won. "Congratulations, loser," he had said, his tone flat and cold, like the words didn't even cost him anything, like I wasn't even worth the effort of real emotion anymore, and then he added, "We're done." As if those two words were supposed to erase everything we had built together over the last 8 years, every late night, every quiet sacrifice, every moment I stood behind him when no one else did, and for a second, I just stood there. Not because I didn't understand what he meant, but because I understood it too well. The house felt different that night, like it didn't belong to me anymore, like every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall had already taken his side, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the ticking of the clock above the hallway, small sounds that suddenly felt louder than anything he was saying, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel so final. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated now, like my silence was ruining the version of this moment he had planned in his head, and he started talking again, faster this time, listing reasons, justifications, things he had probably been telling himself for weeks, maybe months, about how I was holding him back, how I wasn't enough, how he deserved better, and I watched him closely, not the words, but the way his shoulders relaxed between sentences, the way he avoided looking directly at me. For too long, and that was when it clicked, this wasn't just anger, this was confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from having a safety net, from knowing that no matter what happens, you won't fall. That realization didn't break me, it did the opposite, it steadied me, because suddenly, this wasn't just about a failing marriage, it was about something bigger, something he thought I didn't understand, and that was when I finally spoke, my voice calm. Quieter than I expected, but firm enough that it cut through the room like a line drawn in the middle of everything we used to be. "Call your parents," I repeated, this time looking directly at him, and for a moment, just a brief moment, the certainty in his eyes flickered, like a light struggling against the dark, and I knew then that whatever he thought this night was going to be, he hadn't planned for me to say that. 24 hours earlier, everything still looked normal if you only glanced at it from the outside, the kind of normal that fools people who do not know where to look, because our house was clean, the lights were warm, and the dinner I made sat untouched but perfect on the table like a picture from a magazine, and if someone had walked in at that moment, they would have thought we were just another couple winding down after a long day. But I had already learned that normal can be the quietest warning sign. Ethan came home later than usual that evening, his footsteps slower, heavier, not tired but deliberate, like each step had already been decided before he even opened the front door, and when he saw me standing by the kitchen counter, he gave me a quick glance, not the kind that lingers, not the kind that says anything, just enough to acknowledge that I was there and then move on, and that was the first moment something felt off, not because he ignored me, but because it felt intentional. "You are still up," he said, his voice flat, and I nodded, forcing a small smile that I did not feel. "I made dinner," I told him, gesturing toward the table, but he barely looked. Just loosened his tie and walked past me like the room did not belong to both of us anymore, and I remember standing there for a second longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the edge of the counter, feeling the cool surface under my fingertips as if I needed something solid to hold on to. Over the past few weeks, there had been small things, tiny shifts that most people would ignore, the way he started taking calls in another room, the way he kept his phone face down on the table, the way his tone changed when he spoke to me, less patient, less interested, more distant, and I told myself it was stress, work, anything that sounded reasonable enough to avoid the truth forming quietly in the back of my mind, because once you name it, you cannot ignore it anymore. That night, He poured himself a drink without asking if I wanted one, something he always used to do, and sat down on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his expression calm, almost relaxed, and that was what unsettled me the most. Not anger, not frustration, but calm, because calm meant he had already made a decision long before this moment, and I was only just catching up. I sat across from him, watching the faint reflection of the television flicker across his face, and for a brief second, our eyes met, and there was no warmth there, no hesitation, just distance. Like I had already been moved out of his life in ways that had not yet happened physically, and that was when I noticed it, the folder sitting on the edge of the coffee table, thin, neatly placed, too deliberate to be random, and my chest tightened slightly. Not from panic, but from recognition, because I knew that whatever was inside that folder was not meant to surprise me, it was meant to end something, and the strange part was not the fear, it was the clarity, the quiet realization that whatever he thought he was about to do, he believed he was in control, and that belief was the only reason he looked so calm. There was a time when I believed love was built on effort, on patience, on the quiet things no one else sees, like staying up late to help him finish a proposal, or remembering how he liked his coffee without asking, or choosing to stay calm when he came home frustrated and took it out on the wrong person, and for years, I told myself that was what a strong marriage looked like, two people carrying the weight together even when it felt uneven, but somewhere along the way, that balance disappeared and I was the only one still carrying anything at all. Ethan had always been confident. That was one of the things that drew me to him in the beginning, the way he walked into a room like he belonged there, the way people listened when he spoke. But confidence can change when it is never challenged. It can turn into something sharper, something that does not ask for space, but takes it, and over time, I started to notice how easily he dismissed my opinions, how quickly he interrupted me, how often he spoke for both of us as if my voice was just an extension of his. At first, it was subtle, small comments in front of friends, jokes that made people laugh while I forced a smile, little corrections that made it seem like I had misunderstood something when I knew I had not, and every time it happened, I told myself it was nothing. That I was overthinking, that it was easier to let it go than to start an argument that would last for hours and end with me apologizing just to keep the peace. But the truth was, I was not keeping the peace, I was slowly giving it away. There were nights when he would come home and talk about his successes, his deals, his plans for the future, and I would listen, genuinely proud of him, asking questions, supporting him, and then when I tried to share something about my own day, my own work, he would nod without really hearing me, his attention already somewhere else, and those moments began to stack up, quiet and invisible, until they became something heavier than any single argument we ever had. The hardest part was not the way he treated me in those moments, it was the way I started to accept it, the way I adjusted myself to fit into the space he left for me, smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. And I did it so gradually that I almost did not notice it happening until one day I looked at myself and realized I was no longer the person I used to be. That was why the folder on the table mattered more than anything inside it, because it was not just a piece of paper. It was the final step in something that had been building for a long time, a decision he believed he had earned. And as I sat there watching him scroll through his phone like nothing was about to change, I understood something with a clarity that surprised even me. This was not the moment everything fell apart. This was the moment he thought he had already won, and that belief was the only reason he was about to make a mistake he could not take back. That night, I did not confront him, not immediately, because something in me had already shifted from reacting to observing, and instead of asking questions I already knew he would avoid, I watched, carefully, quietly. Like I was seeing him for the first time without the filter of who I thought he was supposed to be, and the more I paid attention, the more the small details started to feel less random and more like pieces of something planned. Ethan's phone lit up twice while he sat on the couch, the soft glow reflecting in his eyes for just a second before he turned it face down again, a habit he had picked up recently. And I noticed how his thumb hovered over the screen a fraction longer than necessary, like he was deciding what to hide and what to show, and that hesitation told me more than any message ever could. Work, he said casually when he caught me looking, but the word felt rehearsed, too quick, too easy, and I simply nodded, not because I believed him, but because I wanted him to keep believing that I did. The folder on the table remained untouched between us, its edges perfectly aligned with the glass surface, as if it had been placed there with intention, not convenience, and I could feel its presence without even looking directly at it. Like it was quietly waiting for the right moment to be opened, the moment he had already decided on. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water even though I was not thirsty, just to create distance, just to give myself a few seconds to think without his eyes on me, and as I leaned against the counter, I realized something that settled into my chest with surprising calm. This was not impulsive, none of it was. The distance, the silence, the shift in his tone, it had all been building toward this, and whatever was inside that folder was only the final step, not the beginning. When I returned to the living room, he had finally picked it up, holding it loosely in one hand, tapping the edge against his palm like he was preparing himself for something that required control, and that small gesture confirmed everything. He was not nervous. He was managing the moment, shaping it, guiding it exactly where he wanted it to go, and for a brief second, I wondered how long he had been planning this, how many times he had imagined this conversation playing out in his favor. "We need to talk," he said, finally looking at me directly, and there was no warmth in his voice, no hesitation, just a steady tone that carried the weight of a decision already made, and I nodded again, slowly, taking a seat across from him. My hands resting calmly in my lap even though my mind was moving faster than it ever had before, connecting pieces, replaying moments, seeing patterns I had ignored until now. The room felt smaller as he opened the folder, the soft sound of paper shifting louder than it should have been, and I noticed how carefully he avoided rushing, like he wanted every second of this to land exactly the way he intended. But what he did not realize was that I was no longer inside his version of this moment. I was outside it, watching it unfold with a clarity that made everything sharper, more precise, and that clarity came with one simple understanding. He believed I was about to lose everything, and that belief was the only reason he had not considered the possibility that I already knew more than he thought. He placed the folder between us with a deliberate calm that felt almost practiced, like he had imagined this exact angle, this exact distance, even the way the light from the lamp reflected faintly off the glass table, and for a moment, neither of us touched it, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional rather than awkward, and then he pushed it slightly toward me, not forcefully, just enough to signal that this was my part in the scene he had already written. "You should read it," he said, his voice steady, controlled, the kind of tone someone uses when they believe they are being reasonable, when they believe they are offering something fair, and I looked down at the papers without reaching for them, already knowing what they would say before seeing a single word. "It is simple," he continued, leaning back slightly as if to give himself space, as if distance made him more convincing. "We both move on. Clean. No complications." His choice of words lingered in the air, clean, like he was describing a transaction, not a marriage, like 8 years could be reduced to a line item on a document, signed and filed away. I let a few seconds pass before finally picking up the top page, the paper smooth under my fingers, the text printed in sharp black lines that felt colder than they should have, and as my eyes moved across the words, I noticed how carefully everything had been structured, the terms, the clauses, the way responsibilities were divided. It was all precise, efficient, almost clinical, and that told me more than anything else. This was not something he had put together in a moment of anger. This was planned, reviewed, finalized. "You have been thinking about this for a while," I said quietly, not as a question but as a statement, and he gave a small shrug, the kind that dismisses time as irrelevant when the outcome feels inevitable. "I have been thinking about what is best," he replied, his gaze steady on me now, waiting for a reaction, maybe expecting anger, maybe expecting tears, something that would confirm the role he had already assigned me in this moment. But I did not give him that. Not because I was unaffected, but because something inside me had already shifted beyond that point, beyond reacting the way he expected. Instead, I turned another page slowly, letting the silence stretch again, and I could feel his attention sharpen, the slight change in his posture, the way he leaned forward just enough to study my face, searching for cracks, for signs that his words were landing the way he intended. "You will be fine," he added after a moment, his tone softer now, almost patronizing, like he was offering comfort. He did not believe I needed but felt obligated to give. "This is better for both of us." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was, how perfectly it fit into the narrative he had built, the one where he was decisive, rational, justified, and I was simply someone who needed to accept it. I placed the papers back down carefully, aligning them exactly as they had been before, and for the first time since he started speaking, I looked at him without any uncertainty, without any hesitation, just clarity, and in that moment, I could see the confidence in his expression, the quiet belief that this was already over, that all that remained was my signature, my agreement, my quiet exit from the life he had decided to leave behind, and that belief, more than anything he had said, was what made the next part inevitable. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a line that had already been crossed, but not yet acknowledged, and I could feel his patience starting to thin, not because he was unsure, but because I was not reacting the way he expected, and that was when he leaned forward again, his voice losing that careful calm he had been holding on to. "Claire," he said, sharper this time, like he was trying to pull me back into the role he had written for me, "I am not asking for a discussion. I am telling you what is happening." The words landed heavily, not because they hurt, but because they confirmed everything I had already realized. This was never meant to be a conversation. It was a conclusion he had already reached on his own. I lifted my eyes to meet his, steady, unshaken, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across his expression. Not doubt, not yet, but confusion, the kind that appears when reality does not match expectation. "You think this is finished," I said quietly, my voice even, controlled, and he let out a small breath, almost amused, shaking his head slightly as if I was missing something obvious. "It is finished," he replied, leaning back again, reclaiming his confidence. "You just have not accepted it yet." There it was again, that certainty, that belief that everything was already decided, and for a moment I let him have it, let the silence settle just long enough for him to relax into it, to believe he had regained control of the moment, and then I reached for my phone. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it was enough to shift the air between us, and I saw his eyes follow it immediately, narrowing slightly, trying to understand what I was doing and why. I did not rush. I unlocked the screen slowly, my thumb steady, my breathing even, and then I looked back at him, holding his gaze for just a second before speaking. "Call your parents," I said again, the words clearer this time, firmer, leaving no room for interpretation. He let out a short laugh, the kind that dismisses something without fully understanding it, and he shook his head. "Why would I do that?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of irritation now, like I was wasting his time, like this was a distraction from the ending he had already planned. I did not answer immediately. I simply watched him, letting the weight of the moment settle in, letting the question linger just long enough to make it uncomfortable, and then I spoke, each word deliberate. "Because they should hear this," I said, my voice calm but unyielding, and that was when the shift happened, subtle but undeniable, his posture straightening, his expression tightening, not fear, not yet, but something closer to unease. The first crack in that certainty he had been holding onto all night. "There is nothing for them to hear," he replied quickly, too quickly, and that was all the confirmation I needed, because people who are truly confident do not rush to shut something down. They let it happen. They let it prove itself meaningless, but he did not. He resisted, and that resistance spoke louder than anything he had said so far. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply held his gaze and repeated the same words, slower this time, letting each one land exactly where it needed to. "Call your parents," and this time, the room felt different. The balance shifting in a way that could not be ignored, because for the first time that night, he was no longer entirely sure of what What happened next? For a long moment, he did not move, his eyes fixed on me like he was trying to decide whether I was serious or simply delaying the inevitable, and I could see the calculation happening behind his expression. The quiet attempt to regain control of something that had just slipped slightly out of his hands, and then he let out a slow breath, reaching for his phone with a kind of reluctance that did not match the confidence he had shown just minutes before. "Fine," he said, his tone tight, like he was agreeing just to prove that whatever I was suggesting meant nothing, like this would somehow reinforce his position instead of challenge it, and he scrolled through his contacts before pressing the call button, holding the phone up to his ear as it rang. The sound filled the room, sharp and repetitive, each tone stretching the silence thinner, and I watched him closely, noticing the way his jaw tightened just slightly with each ring, the way his fingers tapped once against the back of the phone before going still again. Small signs that something inside him was no longer as steady as he wanted it to be. "Mom," he said when the call connected, his voice shifting instantly, softer, more controlled, almost practiced in a different way now. "Are you and Dad home?" There was a pause as he listened, his eyes flicking toward me briefly before looking away again, and then he nodded to himself. "Good," he continued, "I need you both to stay on the line. I am putting this on speaker." He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before pressing the button, and then the room filled with another presence, distant but unmistakable. "Ethan, what is going on?" His mother's voice came through, calm but curious, followed by his father's quieter tone in the background asking a similar question, and for a brief moment, everything felt suspended. Like we had stepped into a different version of the night where more than just the two of us were now involved. Ethan straightened slightly, reclaiming some of his earlier composure, as if their presence gave him something to stand on again, and he glanced at me once more before speaking. "Nothing complicated," he said, his voice steady again, almost confident. "Claire and I are ending things. I just thought it would be better if you heard it directly." There was a pause on the other end, not shocked, not yet, just processing, and I could imagine the look his mother would be giving his father, the silent exchange that always happened between them before either of them spoke. "Is that true?" his father asked finally, his tone measured, directed at me now, not him, and I stepped closer to the table, my eyes still on Ethan as I answered. "We're about to find out," I said calmly, and that was when the shift became undeniable, because his parents did not respond immediately, and Ethan's expression changed just enough to reveal it. The first real crack in the certainty he had been holding onto all night. "Claire," his mother said carefully after a moment, her voice no longer casual, no longer distant. "What do you mean by that?" I did not rush my answer. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle across all of us, for the tension to build in a way that could not be ignored, and then I reached for the folder again, turning it slightly so that it faced him instead of me, my fingers resting lightly on the edge as I spoke. "I mean," I said, my voice steady, controlled, "that before anything is finished, there is something your son should have told you, and this time," when I looked at Ethan, there was no confusion in his eyes anymore, only the beginning of something far more uncertain. Something he could no longer dismiss or control, because whatever came next was no longer part of the plan he thought he had already won. The moment the words left my mouth, the room seemed to tighten around us, not physically but in a way that made every second feel heavier, more deliberate, and on the other end of the line, I could hear the subtle shift in his parents' breathing. The quiet awareness that whatever was coming next was not part of the simple explanation they had just been given. Ethan's reaction was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but sharp in a way that revealed more than any outburst could have, his hand moving slightly toward the folder as if to stop me, then pulling back just as quickly, like he realized that any sudden movement would only confirm what he did not want them to suspect. "There is nothing else," he said quickly, his voice firmer now, almost defensive, but it lacked the ease he had earlier, the smooth control he had been holding onto slipping just enough to be noticed, especially by people who knew him as well as they did. "Claire is just upset," he added, turning slightly toward the phone as if positioning himself between me and the conversation, like he could manage the narrative if he spoke first, if he kept everything contained. I did not interrupt him, I let him finish, because sometimes silence is more powerful than contradiction, and when he was done, I simply placed my hand flat on the folder, grounding myself in the reality of what I was about to say. I am not upset, I said calmly, my voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear, and that alone created a pause on the line, a small but noticeable hesitation that told me his parents were listening more carefully now, not just to the words, but to the space between them. Ethan, his father said after a moment, his tone quieter, more focused, let her speak. That was all I needed, not permission, but acknowledgement, a shift in attention that could not be undone, and I met Ethan's eyes briefly, seeing the tension there, the realization that he was no longer directing this conversation, that it had moved somewhere he could not easily control. Before anything is signed, I continued, my fingers lightly tapping the edge of the folder once, a small, almost absent gesture that helped me keep my pace measured. There is something you both should know, something that has been in place for a long time. I let that sentence settle, not rushing into the next, because timing mattered, the weight of each word building on the last, and on the other end of the line, I could hear his mother inhale softly. The sound barely there, but enough to signal that she understood this was not about emotion. This was about information. The house, I said, glancing briefly around the room, the walls, the furniture, the space that had once felt shared, but now stood as evidence of something else entirely, is not just in Ethan's name. There was a pause, longer this time, heavier, and I saw Ethan's expression shift again, the certainty fading further, replaced by something more rigid, more controlled, like he was trying to hold on to a version of reality that was slipping away from him. What do you mean? His mother asked, her voice no longer casual, no longer distant, but precise, and I answered without hesitation. I mean that the ownership, the legal structure, the agreements that were put in place when this property was transferred, they were not designed the way Ethan seems to think they were. My eyes remained on him as I spoke, not to challenge him, but to anchor the truth in a way that could not be dismissed, and for the first time that night, he did not interrupt, he did not correct, he did not speak at all. Because he knew exactly what I was referring to, even if he had never taken the time to fully understand it, and that was the difference between us. I had paid attention, and he had assumed. And now that assumption was beginning to unravel in front of the only people whose opinion he had counted on to support him. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the quiet realization that something fundamental had just shifted, and on the other end of the line, I could hear it in the way his parents did not respond immediately. The absence of reassurance louder than any words they could have offered, and when his father finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "Ethan," he said slowly, carefully, "what is she talking about?" The question was simple, but it landed with precision, cutting through the last layer of control Ethan had been holding on to, and for the first time that night, he did not have an immediate answer. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, his gaze dropping to the table for just a second before lifting back up, searching for something to say that would restore the version of reality he had built, but there was nothing left to use. "It is not relevant," he said finally, his tone tighter now, less certain, and that was. When I shook my head, just once, not in defiance, but in quiet correction. "It is the only thing that is relevant," I said, my voice steady, and I could feel the shift settle completely into place, no longer subtle, no longer uncertain, but clear, defined, irreversible. I picked up the top page of the documents he had prepared, holding it lightly between my fingers, and glanced at it for a brief moment before setting it back down again, exactly where it had been, because I did not need to read it anymore, not now. "You created a plan based on what you thought you had," I continued, looking at him, not with anger, not with hurt, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, "but you never checked what was actually there." The words were not loud, but they carried enough weight to settle into the room, into the silence, into the space where his confidence used to be. On the phone, his mother spoke again, her voice quieter now, more cautious. "Claire, explain it." And so I did, not rushed, not emotional, just factual. each sentence placed carefully, each detail allowed to stand on its own, because the truth did not need emphasis, it only needed to be heard. I explained the structure that had been put in place years ago, the legal agreement his parents themselves had approved, the one that ensured the property, the one thing he believed gave him control. Was not something he could simply walk away from or divide without consequence, and as I spoke, I watched his expression change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, the certainty fading, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Something that looked a lot like understanding. There was no interruption this time, no attempt to redirect the conversation, because there was nothing left to redirect it toward, and when I finished, the silence that followed felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but settled. Like everything had finally been placed where it belonged. His father spoke again after a moment, his tone firm now, no longer questioning. "Ethan, we need to talk about this," and that was it, no defense, no support, just a statement that made it clear where things stood. Ethan did not respond immediately, and when he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, not broken, not defeated, but stripped of the certainty that had carried him through the night. I stood there for a second longer, letting the moment complete itself, letting the reality settle fully into place, and then I turned away, not dramatically, not angrily, just calmly, because there was nothing left for me to prove, nothing left to argue. And as I walked toward the hallway, I realized something that felt both simple and final. I had not lost anything that night. I had only stopped carrying what was never mine to hold alone.